Welcome to today's tutorial. Let's get started. Let's look at our agenda for today. Today we're looking at using two Ethernet ports on the XL Prime. We'll start by talking about why is dual Ethernet an advantage. Then we'll talk about how dual Ethernet was implemented on the XL series, and then examine how we've had to implement it on the XL Prime series. We'll look at how that impacts installation and how that impacts configuration and programming. So first let's talk about why is dual Ethernet an advantage. Well, first of all, it gives the OEM the ability to have a dedicated machine network on their machine where any I/O or drives or any peripherals at all that need to use Ethernet protocols can talk directly to their OCS controller and guarantee that none of the equipment will have to interact with plant equipment. That's because there's a second dedicated Ethernet port that they can hand over to their end manufacturer customers. So their customers can add the SCADA system or ERP system or whatever it is that their customer wants to connect to the machine. Now let's look at how we implemented dual Ethernet on our XL series. Two of the most popular units with this capability are the XL7 and the EXL10. The XL15 Plus also has this capability, so let's first talk about physical installation. When you look at the XL7 and the EXL10, you'll notice that there are two physical ports next to each other on the back of the unit. Keep in mind that each of these ports are completely independent. They're not based on some sort of internal Ethernet switch circuitry. Looking at this graphic, you'll notice that LAN2 is on the left and LAN1 is on the right. And of course these units are silkscreen. And once again they are two completely separate Ethernet ports. From a configuration standpoint, there's a lot of things you can do with dual Ethernet. First of course is you can program from Cscape over Ethernet. One of the more popular things that you can do with Ethernet is protocol communication. Before we do that, we need to make sure that each of the two ports that we are configuring are on a separate subnet. So how do we do that? Well, you'll notice when you go to hardware configuration, if you've selected an OCS model that supports two Ethernet ports, you'll notice both LAN1 and LAN2 are listed. And they each have a config button that you can press, and when you go into each of these ports, that's where you have access to configure the IP address, the net mask, the gateway, etc. So at that point you can ensure that through configuration that the two ports are on separate sides. Now let's go back to using Ethernet to communicate with other industrial devices. We have a few different classifications of protocols that our customers can use for that. First, we have what we call a resident protocol. A resident protocol is embedded in the OCS firmware, so it just needs to be enabled in Cscape along with some configuration information, and then the OCS will be ready to execute that protocol. For the small amount of extra configuration that might be required for any given protocol, you simply select that protocol and then press the Configure Selected Protocol button in order to make that happen. The types of protocols that are resident protocols in the OCS include Modbus TCP server, Ethernet IP I/O adapter, Ethernet global data, FTP for file transfers, NTP for calibrating or synchronizing the clock of the OCS with a network time server, and then also the server version of ASCII over TCP IP. One protocol you'll notice on the list that you need to be careful with is HTTP web server. Now this is not WebMI support, this is legacy HTTP version 1.1, which has been available with our products for over 10 years. So unless you're a customer who's been using it for a long time with a legacy implementation, you'll want to leave that HTTP web server checkbox unchecked, because if it is checked, WebMI will not work. Now, in addition to resident protocols, the OCS also supports what's called downloadable protocols. These protocols aren't completely embedded in firmware. There's extra information that has to be downloaded between Cscape and the OCS controller. For that, there's a DLL file for each of these downloadable protocols, most of which are installed in the Cscape install. It's possible that you have a special downloadable protocol that you receive from Horner or download separately from the Cscape install, And in that case, you're going to need to make sure that the DLL file finds its way into the Cscape Ethernet protocols folder. Once you've done that, you can restart Cscape, and then the next time you look at the list of available downloadable protocols, you should see your protocol on the list. But again, most of those protocols you see here on the screen, if not all of them, are installed with Cscape. Some of those downloadable protocols include Modbus TCP client, Ethernet IP Logix tag exchange, where you exchange tag data with a Rockwell Logix CPU, BACnet IP, which has become very popular in building automation, and then also the client version of ASCII over TCP IP. Next, let's talk about the difference between LAN1 and LAN2 in terms of which of these tasks you can perform on which port. Well, the good news is you can perform any of these tasks on both ports. So again, you can program over Cscape on both ports, or you can have different protocols or some of the same protocols running on both ports, etc. It really depends on what you need. Again, going back to the first slide, a lot of the time you'll probably be doing different machine tasks on LAN1, and you'll probably be leaving LAN2 to your customer. For example, you might be doing things on LAN2 like enabling Modbus TCP server to allow data access of your machine to your customer, but there's no significant difference between port 1 and port 2. Now let's talk about how we've implemented dual Ethernet on XL Prime. Up till now, we've just been talking about dual Ethernet when it comes to the XL series, but now let's look at how we implemented Ethernet on the XL Prime. In the current environment, it's difficult to get a lot of components, including Ethernet chips. So the chips we wanted to use to be able to embed a second LAN port on the motherboard of the XL Prime just weren't available. So here we had a couple of choices. One, we could wait for the chips to be available, and that would have meant delaying the XL Prime for months or even up to a year. Another option was to just not make that second port available at all and make the XL7 Prime and the XL10 Prime a single port Ethernet product, which was not a good option either. So we finally settled upon a third option, and that is we're including in the box a USB to Ethernet adapter that can be plugged into the USB port on the back of the XL7 Prime or the EXL10 Prime that will allow and provide that LAN2 functionality. There's no special drivers that are required or anything like that. It's just a matter of plugging that adapter into the USB port on the back of the XL Prime. The second LAN connector is still on the motherboard of the XL Prime, but it's not functional. So be aware that you'll still see two Ethernet connectors, but the second one is non-functional, and in order to get LAN2 functionality, you'll have to use the adapter. Now, you may be thinking that there has to be some negative impact from that. So let's talk about some of the potential issues of connecting Ethernet to an adapter versus directly into the unit itself. Your first thought might be, how secure does that adapter actually plug into that port? Because if it falls out, suddenly you won't have Ethernet capability. Here, all the USB ports used on OCS are special high retention USB ports. That's true for both the USB A port and the Mini B port for programming. So these retention ports meet all Class 1 Division 2 standards for operation from UL. So that means UL is very confident that these ports will hold whatever is plugged into them and not allow it to fall out. So that means you can rest easy knowing that the USB Ethernet adapter isn't going to come loose, and you'll find that as soon as you plug it in, it's held very securely. The next thing you might think is that with the extra bulk of the adapter, you may have to do something special when it comes to dressing up the cabling at the back of the XL7 Prime or EXL10 Prime. But that's not an issue either. That adapter has a very low mass and it's really just like dressing a regular Ethernet cable, so that's not a problem. So what about performance? USB isn't as fast as Gigabit Ethernet, for instance, so you may wonder, is that going to be a problem? Well, keep in mind that very few industrial Ethernet applications are designed to take advantage of the extra bandwidth and the extra speed of Gigabit Ethernet. So in reality, because of the types of protocols that we're using here, i.e. we're not streaming a video or anything like that over these Ethernet connections, you'll find that even though we're using a USB 2.0 interface in between the OCS and the Ethernet network, it has no impact whatsoever on the throughput. so that's definitely not an issue. So what about functionality or configuration? So is the fact that we're using an adapter on LAN2 going to reduce what we can do on that port, or will it change any of the configuration requirements? Or if you have an XL7 or an EXL10 that we want to upgrade to Prime, will you have to make programming changes in order to change to this adapter on the Prime? The answer again here is there is no impact in terms of functional changes or configuration changes. One potential impact that you do need to keep in mind is if you're already utilizing the USB A port on your existing application, say with an XL7 or an EXL10, and now you also want to plug in another USB device like this adapter. Then you need to take a look at implementing a USB hub, because you can plug in a USB hub to the OCS USB port, and then you'll have multiple USB ports that you can use to plug in multiple devices. So not only the Ethernet adapter, but you could also plug in a USB flash drive, a USB camera, etc. So if you're already using that USB port in your application and you want to upgrade to Prime, then you should consider using a USB hub. Horner has tested the Realtek RTS5411 chipset, which is available in a lot of different USB hubs to ensure that there won't be any compatibility issues. So now quickly let's talk about selecting a USB hub. If you need to use a USB hub, what criteria or steps should you follow when selecting one? Horner has thoroughly tested a chipset called the Realtek RTS5411. This chipset is used in many different USB 3.0 hubs. And even though the OCS is not necessarily based around the USB 3.0 like most other industrial devices, we've proven through testing that this chipset works really well with the XL Prime. So if you can find a USB hub based around that chipset, that reduces any compatibility risks. Other things you should consider include its construction. So is it constructed appropriately for your application? For example, you may prefer a USB hub that's more ruggedly constructed or made out of aluminium or metal. However, there's also well-made plastic USB hubs available as well. Another thing to consider is the voltage. So is it a voltage that's going to be easy for you to supply in the application? So those are some things to consider when you're selecting a USB hub. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, so there's our webinar on the using the second serial port on the Prime. Got a question in. When are you planning to introduce functionality of LAN2 in XL Prime without the USB to LAN? As we said in the video, the problem is we've designed in a particular chip to do the handling of the second Ethernet port, but unfortunately the chips are just not available at the moment due to things being run down over the COVID period, and that production of that chip hasn't picked up again yet. We don't have a date yet for when it'll happen, but it will happen as soon as that chip becomes available. We're constantly monitoring the supply situation on that, so hopefully it'll be fairly soon. Okay, so no further questions. Let's have a look at the upcoming webinars. So at the moment, we've obviously just done the using 2 Ethernet ports on the XL Prime. 2 scheduled coming up. Using Modbus TCP and Modbus RTU in an IEC programming environment. So that'll cover the slight differences in how we handle the different Modbus communications within the IEC. And then following that, we've got what is MQTT spark plug. So we have a version of MQTT support which adopts the spark plug layer, which fits over MQTT and is specifically designed for IoT applications. So we run through exactly what that is and how we use it and how you would implement that into an IoT application with the MQTT spark plug. Okay, so they're the next 2 coming up. Will be we're working at the moment on the schedule for the batch after those. So hopefully we can run through a few more of what's coming up when we do our next webinar in a week's time regarding the Modbus in the IEC 61131 environment. So thank you very much for attending, everybody, today, and we'll see you soon, hopefully. Thank you very much.